Welcome to Cross Section, conversations at the intersection of faith, news, and culture. We are excited to be on YouTube. Please subscribe to the Evangelical Alliance YouTube channel to never miss an episode.
Coming up in this week's episode of Cross Section, we discuss why it seems Labour just keep U-turning, what is happening with benefit cuts, the winter fuel allowance and the 2-child cap. We also debate whether or not Christians should watch or read Harry Potter in light of the new cast announcement. This is an episode you do not want to miss. Hello and welcome back to Cross Section. If you are watching on YouTube, you will see that it is an exciting day because Alicia, Danny and I are all sat together in the studio, which is always a joy. Welcome, both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. You'll also notice if you're watching that these two are very smartly dressed and I am less smartly dressed, which is feeling more obvious when we're sat next to each other around this table. But these two are off to Westminster later. So that's great. And I am just here in my dungarees. But yeah, it is a joy to be back together recording. Today is the 29th of May. So we thought we'd start off this episode with a little moment of each taking a story that has caught our eye in the last couple of weeks. Danny, what is yours to bring to the table?
Well, this is less of a news story, but more of a continuation of something that we've talked about. Last week, I had a fairly long journey back from Poland, so I queued up my podcasts, and in that queue was an over 3-hour episode with Wesley Huff, a Canadian apologist, on the Flagrant podcast. I had never heard of the Flagrant podcast before, but it's a big podcast. This episode has been watched by nearly 2 million people. It's over 3 hours long, and this is Wesley Huff talking about all aspects of the Christian faith to a mixed audience ranging from interested agnostic to secular Hindu. There's like 4 people on the couch with him chatting. It goes everywhere. It literally goes everywhere. And then right at the last minute, as he's about to leave, they're like, can you just explain the Trinity, please? And it is fascinating for this cultural moment we're in, this vibe shift, dare I even say, with an interest in Christianity. But also it is a total masterclass in communication. His ability to answer questions, pivot, but get into the details, communicate the gospel clearly and winsomely. It's worth 3 hours of your time.
Wow. If anyone's on a plane, then you've got your recommendation for what to do. I also can't believe that Vibe Shift has come up, even though Peter's not here. It just can't be avoided. So my story is one that I'm sure many of you will have seen and kind of been encouraged by, but it is the references that Joel Ward, the Crystal Palace captain, made to his faith after they won the FA Cup. I know lots of footballers are Christians, and I think it's such a cool witness when they speak about it. I think the fact that he had just won, the team had just won, and he was mentioning his faith and mentioning Jeremiah and bringing it back to Jesus and sharing the importance of the gospel in his life is just really cool. And many other players have also done that and just given the glory to God, which is so cool in the moment of such a kind of success and a high. So that is something I was really encouraged by, and do check out the clip on social media if you haven't seen it, because it's very encouraging. And Alicia, what was yours?
On the back of that, I do think it's incredibly encouraging that Christians are, particularly sports people, footballers, are using the opportunity to a global audience to talk about their faith. Added to that, even though I'm a disgruntled Arsenal fan with another disappointing season, Alisson Becker, who's the Liverpool goalkeeper, chose to put on a T-shirt that said, Jesus is the way, the truth and the life. Again, a global audience that is witnessing him celebrate a moment of winning the Premier League, but also a witness to his colleagues and to the world that actually, again, all the glory goes to Jesus, which I just think is incredible. Not my story, even though it was encouraging. I think for me, what has been frustrating, and it's a political news story, is kind of the incoherent conversations that are going both amongst national politicians and regional mayors around drug policy. So within 24 hours, we had the Mayor Sadiq Khan, London Mayor, come out talking about the consideration following his commission and review of decriminalising cannabis or natural cannabis, those in small possession, which seems to me a complete counter narrative to the problem that we're seeing of rising drug use amongst young people, amongst a younger age group. And then 24 hours later, we have kind of the national government conversation around the banning of vapes because of the reality that so many children and young people are caught in an addiction there that is fueling kind of their own self-confidence, their own mental health, and all of that. And then side to that, we have Glasgow that has drug consumption and locals saying that their community looks like a wasteland, that they're seeing syringes in and around. So for me, that news story is deeply worrying, that we're having this conversation of a progressive ideal that kind of legalizing or decriminalizing a form of drug is good use, yet the evidence shows that actually it doesn't solve the problem, that addiction is on the rise across different demographic groups. So for me, I feel that the politics and the policy is completely at sea, and it needs more engagement. I know Chris is doing incredible work in Scotland, who's a part of our team, talking about drug and addiction use in Scotland. And I think that conversation is slowly going to grow within England and Wales. So yeah, that's my news story.
Yeah, absolutely. Really helpful that you brought that to the table. And that will definitely be something that we keep an eye on. And I'm sure, we will see what happens and continue to engage with it in the ways that we best see fit. But yeah, so our first conversation is kind of a sort of summary and deep dive into Labour's last couple of weeks and all that's been going on there. Seems that they've kind of been U-turning on a couple of things, promises being changed, all this kind of upheaval. Danny, what's been going on? What are the headlines?
It does seem like we're in a moment where the government are reassessing some of their economic plans and particularly some of their welfare spending plans. When the Labour government came into power in July last year, one of the first things they did was say that they would change the eligibility for winter fuel payments, taking it away from all but the lowest income pensioners. There was uproar, disagreement, lots of people very unhappy about it, including within the Labour Party, but the government have stood firm by it through a lot. And yet now, just a week ago, the government announced that actually they were going to U-turn on that policy. They haven't given the details of how they're going to do it, of what will be in its place, of how it will operate, but they have U-turned on it, and that has sparked a bit more chat about what else might they have to change, whether it's the two-child benefit, proposed disability things, some of the things we might get into. Questions being raised of actually, are the government making the right decisions, the best decisions in their welfare and benefit spending particularly, and then on their tax policy as well. There was a leaked memo from the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, where she had set out to Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, 10 things that should be done. This was before the budget earlier in the year, none of which were taken forward, but clearly showing that there is disagreement within the party about the best approach for them to take on economics.
Gosh, yeah, it does feel like such a minefield. Alicia, what have your kind of responses been, or how much have you kind of engaged in the way it's been going from here to there, to there, to there?
I mean, half of the news story was whilst I was away, so it was nice to observe it whilst I was on leave, and then come back to, we've got so many U-turns that are likely to happen. But I think the fascination is a U-turn without articulating what the U-turn is. So there's a level of, we're going to review this and we're going to do it at the next fiscal event. So I think the 11th of June, which is the spending review, puts a little bit more meat on the bones and what does it look like around winter fuel payments. I think the ongoing conversation around the two-child benefit cap, these are conversations within the Labour Party, particularly amongst new MPs who were somewhat incensed that I'm a part of the Labour Party and this isn't the government policy that I imagined we would be doing, that we would be taking payments away from the elderly at a time of vulnerability and the issue of poverty, and then equally that we would continue to endorse and continue a policy around kind of children and how much kind of tax credit is given to families on that. And so there's this murmurings within the backbenches as well as within cabinet of saying, actually, what is the Labour Party for if it's not to address and tackle issues of inequality and poverty? And I think we're seeing the reality of government. I think the government is wanting to balance the books in kind of layman's terms, is what they're trying to do, yet they have to make very difficult decisions. Where's that money going to come from? I think we're going to see in the spending review some really tough decisions, potentially rumours of tax increases in order to fund these things.
And I think there's something really interesting in all of this about the realities and the challenges of governing. So the articulation for changing the winter fuel allowance last year was, we're facing a difficult economic situation. Now, that's always been a bit funny for me because it's a relatively small amount given some of the other things, given the overall economic challenges. It was a choice. There was a choice to do this particular thing rather than something else. It was almost kind of sending a signal saying, we're going to take the tough decisions. And then having done that, they're now having to roll back on that and saying, well, yeah, we've taken them, but are we going to? And then the two-child benefit cap has been something where they've said, yes, we don't like it, but we have to be sensible and mature and responsible. And they've been trying to articulate this responsibility in government narrative. And I would contrast it to some of the announcements from Reform over the last few weeks on some of their policies, particularly whether that's around raising income tax rates, marriage tax allowance, which in theory I'd be very supportive of, but financially is very expensive. I think as they do better in the polls, Reform will be asked questions about the credibility of their policies. And it's whether they will face a situation where they're having to U-turn some of these policies, because once they start working out, well, were we to get into power, what would we do about it? There is a level of reality in governing that comes up. And I think where I'd want to get to in this is that there's need for integrity in it, like both in terms of what you're offering, but also how you handle difficult decisions, like being honest with the electorate that there are difficult decisions. And I think actually from a Christian perspective, that's something we should really encourage. We don't want politicians just to sell us an idea, sell us a hope when actually they can't deliver it. We want politicians to speak with integrity and honesty about the challenges, but also offer some hope in terms of the solutions. Like, I get the politics of it. I get why they do these things, but actually I think we should be asking more of our politicians.
And the kind of other difficult conversation that's going on alongside all of this is to do with the benefit cuts, and particularly the kind of impact that will be had on disabled people. There have been many disabled celebrities that have urged Starmer to kind of scrap what his plans are to cut PIP, which is personal independence payments. And kind of, I have been reading up on some of the impacts that would be had if they were, such as, disabled households already face 63% higher living costs. They have around £1,010 a month in extra expenses, lots of food bank reliance, rising poverty. It's huge. The impact is really big. And this has really been dominating the media conversations.
And I think it's going to, and we touched on this briefly before, and I think it is worth saying that as people have looked at it and looked at the impact of it and realised just how widespread the impact of the changes will be, they'll affect people who lose all of their PIP. Some people will lose some of it. Some aspects will be affected. That actually it will make a really significant difference to a lot of disabled abilities and their ability. The whole point of PIP, personal independence payments, are to enable people to go about their daily lives. So it's not linked to whether they work or not. Often it is to help them work or to help them do day-to-day tasks. And actually that is something that I would have thought should be a priority, because actually we want people to have dignity of being able to work where they can, engage in daily life. And I think that is something I'd like to see promoted and encouraged.
And coming back to your point earlier about the decisions government needs to make and having integrity with that, I feel this isn't going to be an easy decision for the government, whichever way they turn, particularly for the minister responsible. Liz Kendall has come out and spoken that the government's $5 billion of disability benefit cuts, the argument she's making is it stops the welfare state imploding upon itself. So her rationale is that we're taking a very difficult decision that impacts a very vulnerable and dependent group so that the welfare state more broadly is sustainable long term. And I think that's a conversation that the church needs to lean into in terms of how do we have a system that holistically supports people and doesn't implode. But equally, I think in this moment, the church also needs to push back on that and saying you're making the wrong cut because of the vulnerability that particularly the disabled community and their supporting families have on that. So I think there's still going to be murmurers within civic society, hopefully more willingly from the church, but equally within the Labour Party, of saying that those 5 billion in savings is not the decision that they should be making in the short, medium or long term. So
yeah, and when you transfer those savings to the fact that up to 1.3 million people could be hit, you suddenly think of, that's people behind those numbers that are then losing out. And as you mentioned, churches and as Christians, we need to be being really mindful of the impact had on our brothers and sisters and those around us, and making sure that we are, supporting those that are struggling and those that, if they are particularly hit, how we as churches can be, being outward and looking out for them. But we'll see what happens and see as the kind of conversation grows and more people kind of get involved. But I would encourage you to look into what is being proposed and what's going on, because if this is something you don't even haven't engaged with at all, I'd really recommend that you do so. You are listening or watching Cross Section, the podcast where we talk about faith, news and culture in light of being Christians. If you want to engage with us more, please do email us at cross.section@eauk.org. We want to hear your thoughts on our discussions, where we've been wrong, where we've been right. Let us know. And also do engage with us on social media. We regularly put out polls, one of which we will be about to speak about. We'd love to be hearing your opinions. I want to know what you think. So do get in touch. So I'm going to move us on to our next story, which is going to be a bigger discussion and is actually slightly different from some that we've had on Cross Section. We're much more leaning into the cultural side of our conversations. But one story that has caught our eye this week is the fact that faith films and Christian films are really growing and doing well and can be blockbusters, making lots of money. There's an article about this. We've got The Chosen, we've got others. What are your guys' initial reactions to that? Mixed, positive?
I think the encouragement for creatives, Christians who are creatives, aspiring in that space, is that the narrative that Christian content exclusively either through The Chosen or through the retelling creatively of gospel message in kind of lived experience is redundant, and there's not people won't go and see that, which was a very dominant narrative when I was growing up, is clearly false, because it's not just being watched by Christians, it's provoking conversation and curiosity amongst others that are just a little bit tired, worn out by the kind of, over sexualization of content that seems to be driven in a lot of TV and films. And people want substance. They want a story. They want to hear about, how someone perseveres through suffering, and how does the gospel or the good news or the Bible, the Christian message, give light to that. And we have so many heroes of faith who've lived that out. And I think it's incredibly encouraging news that Christianity and the arts isn't a swear word, that they can coexist, is well received.
I think this is a caveat for this whole section, is I'm in danger of being wildly inconsistent about some aspects of this conversation. I'll be honest, most of my reaction to Christian explicit films is a bit of a groan sometimes, because I've definitely seen some that are not very good. They're usually very heavy-handed with their storytelling, and I'm not talking about things like The Chosen. I'm more talking about films that are seeking to portray a Christian message through a contemporary story. They're quite heavy-handed. They're often low budget, and I just don't want to watch them. And I think they have a certain reputation, as Alicia alluded to. So I think, if I'm honest, generally I've thought, actually, I'd rather see Christians investing their time and their effort and their creativity into films that serve a wide audience, that aren't just targeted at a Christian audience, but are telling a good story, an appealing story, a fascinating story, a good one, like not just good as in good news, but a good as in it's a good quality story, good quality production, whether that's in literature or in the arts or in media. I want to encourage Christians to contribute to that. And I think Christians can do that and do that. And that's generally been where I've wanted to see their efforts and their energies, rather than on films that are designed specifically for a Christian audience. Although I definitely accept that films and TV programs are having a huge reach and are reaching a lot of people, The Chosen being the most notable, reaching a huge number of people that wouldn't hear the Christian message otherwise.
Yeah, and I was going to say on that, it's so cool, isn't it, when we hear about people coming to faith because they watched The Chosen, and that was their kind of entryway into finding out about the gospel and finding out who Jesus was. And it is cool that, I guess, some films, I actually don't think I've seen that many kind of Christian films, but that if they are being watched by people and it's their first thought of, oh, interesting, then it's cool that they can be used like that. But yeah, I think you're right in that some of them aren't necessarily helpful, but it's definitely a mixture. But I do think what The Chosen has achieved from having such a small budget, but the impact it's had and how much that's grown is very cool to see. But whilst that's been going on, a news story came out this week that was on the front page for maybe a day. The new Harry Potter cast has been announced. The 3 kids that are going to play Ron, Hermione and Harry have been revealed in the new series of Harry Potter. And this has sparked a lot of discussion in our office about how Christians should be engaging with Harry Potter, whether it's okay to watch it, whether we just should avoid it altogether. So we thought we'd bring that discussion here. I'm just going to open it out. What are our responses and reactions to Christians and Harry Potter?
First of all, I didn't know there was a new series coming up until Tuesday.
Which I find surprising because I feel like it has been.
Yeah, I saw the pictures of the 3 people, and I think the person cast to play Harry Potter looks remarkably like Daniel Radcliffe. So I just didn't. So part of me is like, gosh, are we ready for a reboot already?
I know.
And then I looked up and realized that the first film was released in 2001, so 24 years ago. The last film I think was released in 2007, 2008, that kind of
I think
time
even
period.
more recently.
Okay.
Yeah, but
well, I'll get fact checked and someone tell me I'm wrong. Anyway, it doesn't feel that long ago, and yet for people growing up now, they won't have been familiar to that. And I think then this whole conversation about whether Christians should engage with it, I was a teenager when the books were coming out. I remember having conversations with my parents over whether it was appropriate to read them or not, or to watch the films. There were lots of ink being spilt in magazines and articles in particularly the early 2000s, when it was gaining more prominence and more popularity. And it's just fascinating that this has come up once again.
Yeah.
I mean, in my growing up, and there's not a massive age gap between me and Danny, but I was more team Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. So I've not read, I have not watched a Harry Potter film. And so the hype for me around it, I've got no language for it. Although I do know there's very strong feelings within the Christian community around is watching Harry Potter endorsing or encouraging witchcraft, particularly amongst children and young people, and should we be encouraging that? And to my surprise, the EA came out with a position on that once upon a time. So
we didn't quite come out with a position on Harry Potter. What we did do, and I went into our archives yesterday, and we have this.
He's not wearing gloves.
Pamphlet,
oh dear.
That was produced in 1987 called Doorways to Danger. And it was particularly looking at the occult, and Dungeons and Dragons was one of the prompts for this. And there were a number of other things that we produced at that time that were warning Christians from engaging with that kind of literature and media. So it's not new. Harry Potter wasn't the first time this came up. It does come up in other contexts. And I think it's interesting that there are such strong views. And I think Harry Potter is actually a particularly interesting one, because one of the features of our conversation in the office has been that actually, if you track through the whole Harry Potter story, there are some really strong biblical motifs, particularly towards the end of it. And J.K. Rowling would talk about that herself, and she has done subsequently. And yet the presentation of witches and wizards in a good context is something that Christians have really struggled with sometimes, and thought actually that's not something it's sensible to engage with. It normalizes witchcraft and wizardry in a way we wouldn't want to see it normalized. And like, I am on the fence. I am on the fence. I can recognize some of the dangers and some of the challenges, but I've read all the books. I think I've seen all the films. I might not have done. I can't remember. And I can see that actually there's something quite interesting going on. And then I think you have to extend it and say, well, actually, how do we engage with fiction more generally? You referenced Lord of the Rings. I've read and watched those two. Tolkien was a Christian. And C.S. Lewis with his Narnia universe, also Christian. And there's some fascinating engagement between Tolkien and Lewis. And Tolkien thought Lewis was too heavy-handed with his biblical metaphor and imagery. And actually, he just created his own world with incredible depth in it. So I think it provokes all sorts of interesting questions about what is good and what is helpful and what is useful for Christians to engage with.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful. It's part of the kind of wider conversation of how we engage in film, how we engage in TV, how we engage in books. I am a big Harry Potter fan. I've read all of them. I've watched them all multiple times. And so I think it's also just about the kind of whole idea of fantasy world. I mean, I think it's all about how you're sort of receiving it and making sure you're kind of seeing it through that lens. And for me, it's understanding that this is fantasy. This is a made up world. This isn't our world. Obviously, it's kind of set in our world, but then going into another world. But it is completely different. And I think it's keeping that, but it's also understanding how it's impacting your mind and what it's exposing to. And so I do fully understand that kind of idea of actually it is, and as you say, kind of presenting witches as good and all this kind of thing. And that's not necessarily helpful, but so many things that we consume expose us to different things. I mean, I remember when I was pretty young watching an episode of Downton Abbey and they used a Ouija board in it, and me kind of coming away from that being like, whoa. And that was my first proper understanding of what a Ouija board was, and talking about that with my parents and kind of being like, but that's real. Like, people use that in this world. And actually it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that a show that was about a family in the aristocracy from the 1920s in England also exposed me to that. And it's not kind of saying either or, but it's just, I think it's understanding that kind of the fact that it's fantasy, but also it asks wider questions about the whole fantasy genre and how we engage with it.
Yes. My highlight of our conversation yesterday talking about this was the discovery of real life Quidditch matches. I did not know this was a thing.
That's my gift back from the United States.
There is a whole world out there of people playing Quidditch, which, for those unfamiliar with it, is a game that is played with people flying around on broomsticks. And if you want, Google it, look at it. People run around with broomsticks, and it gets really weird. And for me, that's like people just taking fandom to a ridiculous level. But it does show some of the crossover between fantasy and real life. Like that is a silly but relatively harmless example. But actually, the fact that there are blurring lines of what is fiction and what is reality, and that I think has been some of the concern that. In presenting magic and wizardry in a positive light, people will experiment and think it's fun. And because these are the hero characters that you want to emulate and be like them. And I think that is one of the major differences between Narnia and Harry Potter, is that yes, there are witches and there is sorcery in Narnia, but it is very much on the bad side of the table. Whereas in Harry Potter, it is within the world of wizardry, and the heroes are proponents of that. And I think that's why people struggle. But your wider point about fantasy is a really significant one that stretches into fiction. How do we engage with stories that tell us stories? I think stories are stories, they're fiction, they're enjoyable, but they also reflect things about our world. And that's just part of what is a good story. And that is part of what's a good story. And we should be able to engage with that without just wanting to restrict ourselves to non-fiction textbooks. So I think we do need discernment, and we do need sensibility in how we engage, and we need wisdom.
I think the one thing that, just to add to this conversation around, whilst I'm not a Harry Potter fan, never read the books, I think the creation of the books teach something to the church, again, debunking a lie. J.K. Rowling came out with over a 400-page book, 7 series, for which children under the ages of 12 were reading And I think more often than not within the church, we have a mindset that children of young age don't want to read deep content, or more importantly, their Bible reading. There's no appetite for that because children aren't readers or adults aren't readers. And I think that's a huge myth debunker that we as the church need to really become alive to. And the other critique, and kind of that very strong, no, don't watch Harry Potter, or don't watch this, or don't watch that. I remember growing up, you tell me no, I'm going to go and explore for myself. Whereas scripturally, we are taught, teach a person in the ways that they should go and they will not depart from it, or teach a man to fish and they will know truth. And I think as Christians, whether a church leader or a parent or a discipler of others, which all of us, is the core component of being a follower of Jesus, it's important to engage scripturally with difficult conversations about the spiritual world, about the cosmic, about how does the Bible talk about the unseen world? How does it give language to that? How does it talk about the demonic? How does it talk about oppression? How does it talk about all these things? And what are the warning signs that many within scripture have thought, the Israelites, we'll do our own thing, and they create many idols and have destruction? Well, scripture has revealed a lot to us that we're not prepared to read, we're afraid to teach, and therefore we're not discipling. So people are naturally going to go, well, I'm just going to read anything. And when you tell me no, that doesn't work, they've got no language, they've got no biblical literacy, they've got no understanding of how do we engage with, actually, you can just go to the truth within scripture to both safeguard your life and safeguard from others. So I think the whole Harry Potter series, particularly the written and the literature exposed to the church, actually, let's begin to start deep diving in very difficult topics and teaching people to discern right from wrong and truth from falsehoods. And increasingly, as Danny mentioned, discernment. For some people, Harry Potter is not a film that they should watch because it becomes a gateway to other vices and sins that moves on that. Equally, there are some films, let's go beyond Harry Potter. I know Christian friends that have watched Sinful, the current film that's out by I forgot the director from Get Out, that is about vampires, and it's very much on Christian iconography, and it's got a lot about the church and the demonic, and people are watching that, and I would somewhat query watching some of it because it's intentional in its intent of both undermining Christian truth and elevating the demonic. Well, I just don't think you can put that before your eyes and think you won't be impacted in your decision making, your emotions, your speech, how you relate to other people. And there are many, many other films that has references to the occult and spiritualism for which sometimes we're not alert to because we're feeding off the same junk of people who are unbelievers. And I think as Christians, we need to grow sharp in how do we safeguard, not for safety's sake, but actually a real witness in the darkness that roams within society and within media. So
I think if I put my parent hat on and think, actually, what do I think as a parent of two young children, a 5-year-old who asks endless questions about everything. Actually, one, I want those questions to be prompted from the most helpful things. They will be exposed to all sorts of things through their life. And I think it's important as parents we can answer questions. But it is actually ensuring that, well, what's the source material? What is prompting those questions? Why are they asking questions about? And therefore, it's not all going to be Christian material. It can't all be, but actually providing enough good content that helps them to ask good questions, to grow as believers. And there are some good Christian children's books out there. There are not that many. There are some awful children's books out there, some with quite explicit alternative agendas and approaches. And actually, I think that is something for parents to be aware of. I think, yes, we should seek out good stuff. I also want to encourage, again, Christian creatives into writing good content for children. Some that will be explicitly Christian and others that will just be good stories to help them engage with. And then I think it is actually being able to talk to children about it, not being afraid of their questions. Of when they ask a question, actually, what's a Ouija board? What is a witch? Actually being able to answer questions. I think that's where a discerning approach is important, and there will be things that you say no to. And there'll be things you think, actually, I'm going to watch that first, and then we'll watch it together and talk about it. And there'll be other things that actually you're okay with them watching. I think sometimes a straight no to everything can actually put up more barriers and can stop the questions. I think there is a responsibility to safeguard and to steward what children consume. But I think it's done as a discernment is, maybe it's the word of the podcast, that we are actually using our discernment to say and help them to make good choices, because that's the goal. It's not just that they don't do things because they've been told not to do things. It's that children are enabled and discipled so that they are able to make good choices. And I think that's one of the key things in this, that if you're going to say no to something, it's helping children to understand why you've said no to that.
And I think you kind of both touched on this. It's like the conversation in the church as well. I mean, it can be so easy to just avoid it and then leave us all kind of, I think this is okay, I think it's not. But actually just like talking about it, it's kind of talking to your, if your kid's reading Harry Potter and they're suddenly engaging with the concept of a witch for the first time, it's talking about it. It's not kind of shying away from reality, but in obviously an age appropriate way. But also as churches, we do need to be, and sometimes it's really hard to do that, but engaging with these difficult conversations about like the reality of the kind of spiritual realm, and helping us think through the way we're engaging with film, literature, and how the impact that's having on us. Because actually, if we're just engaging and watching and just consuming and taking stuff in, but not thinking about how the Bible speaks into that, then that is going to be a problem. But I think, Harry Potter is such an interesting one as well because of that kind of story arc and what we see at the end, which is essentially Harry kind of sacrificing himself for the greater good and for other people.
Spoiler.
Sorry.
You don't have to watch it.
You don't need to skip we need a spoiler warning on this. But which, that imagery is pretty significant. There are Bible verses talking about, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 26 is on a gravestone in the final book, which literally refers to the kind of defeat of death, which is just interesting. And I think it's making sure that kids that are reading it, watching it, adults that are reading it, watching it, are doing so with that kind of thoughtful lens of what they're taking in and how they're thinking about it, rather than just kind of consuming and not thinking. And that speaks into so many different things. I think what you were saying about other types of films is really helpful. And so all of us will have different areas of things that we probably should avoid because they aren't helpful for our thinking, whatever that might be, whether it's a rom-com or a horror film. We just need to be, talking to each other about how we are consuming the arts and cultural content. Do either of you have any other kind of final thoughts on?
One final thought about J.K. Rowling is that she's a fascinating person. I will be interested with a new series coming out and how the conversation might be different to how it was 25 years ago. And I think J.K. Rowling is now almost as well known for her views around gender and her outspoken support for biological sex, funding court cases, funding all sorts of endeavours. And I think actually a lot of Christians have seen her as an ally in that. And I think we have to sometimes be careful as to how we attach ourselves to other people for whatever causes of convenience. But I think that has changed her perception in public life. I think some of the original stars have wanted to distance themselves from her because of her views. So I think she's a really interesting figure, as well as the stories and the products that have come out of it. And I think that's part of this conversation that for me makes it so interesting.
If Danny's word was discernment, the only other word that I would give is accountability. As Christians, we are to go from one degree of glory to another. We are to be conformed into the image of Christ. I think the more and more we go on with the Lord in our faith, practicing it, being transformed by the word, being, convicted of the Holy Spirit, there will come times where we need to let go of what were preferences in a former year that now cannot be watched or cannot be read or cannot be consumed, because the Lord is doing a new work in you. And I think accountability, regardless if you're in church ministry or not, is a word that all of us as Christians need in our lives and a habit that we should grow in.
For sure. Oh, discernment and accountability. We love it. I would have thought of a really good one now, but I'm not going to do that off the cuff. But I think, there's so much that we could say, and it's a divisive thing because there are so many views and so many different experiences as well with it, which, people bring in their personal experience, what they're kind of the way that they're tempted or whatever it is. And so this conversation I'm sure could just go on and on. But I do encourage you to be having these difficult conversations in your churches with your friends, being honest with each other, keeping each other accountable, and like sharing in what ways you're kind of seeing the Lord at work, but also where you're struggling with this stuff, and just keeping on bringing it to him. But yeah, that is the end of our kind of big Harry Potter debate. Do let us know what you thought.
It was better natured than I thought.
Yeah, no,
we didn't break out into a fight.
We didn't.
No.
It got more intense in the office, I think.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great week.
Hi, Alicia here. Thank you for checking out this episode. If you like it, please make sure to subscribe or share with a friend and leave a review. Till the next episode, take care and God bless.